Thank you so much for coming. My name is Cindy Lee. I'm part of the International Law Society. We're really happy that you're here for the second part of our launch talk series on Islamic State and international law. We have two outstanding speakers with us here today. On the left is Jean-Baptiste Maillart. He's a PhD candidate at University of Geneva, and he's currently a visiting scholar at Duke Law. We also have Antonio Coco. He's also a PhD candidate at University of Geneva, and he's a visiting researcher at Harvard Law School right now. So without further ado, let's give the floor to our two speakers, and they will be open up to questions after the talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cindy. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you very much to the International Law Society, in particular Cindy, for organizing and sponsoring this event. And also thank you very much to the Duke Law School for welcoming me here as a visiting scholar. I'm very happy today and honored to give this presentation together with one of my best friends and colleague, Antonio Coco. So as Cindy was saying, Antonio is a PhD candidate at the University of Geneva. He's also a former teaching assistant at the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. It's actually where we met. And currently visiting a scholar at Harvard Law School. So it's like some sort of a visiting scholar visiting another visiting scholar. Antonio's field of expertise is international criminal law, public international law, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law. Antonio is also a member of the bar and member of the editorial committee of the Journal of International Criminal Justice. So today that is our second seminar of our series of legal seminars entitled The Islamic State and International Law. Today's seminars intends to be much more legal than the first one for those who are here. The first one, I don't know if you remember, we dealt with the historical origins of the Islamic State and also with the nature and main characteristics of the Islamic states by comparison with Al-Qaeda. Today's question is how to defeat the Islamic State. So, of course, it's a very, very difficult question, obviously. We have no pretension to provide neither a clear nor a perfect answer. And actually, if we had this very clear and perfect answer, we would probably not be here again. So we believe that there are several answers to this question, several ways to defeat the Islamic State, not only legal answers, but also political answers and cultural answers. At both the national and the international level. Today we will focus on three legal answers, so three legal avenues: the use of force, state responsibility, and criminal accountability. And so we are going to share with you some of our thoughts, some of our legal thoughts about these three avenues, which should not be seen as alternative, but as complementary. So why did we decide to address these three issues in particular? So the use of force, it's of course the military action. It has been the classic response from states for centuries now to defeat non-state armed groups. So what we're going to do is that we're going to proceed to the assessment of the legality of the US-led coalition airstrikes against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and also in Libya. So here we have three different situations with three different assessments. Then we were going to deal with individual criminal responsibility, which is very important as well. We need to show that there is no impunity in Syria and Iraq. And we need to show that the international community and as an entity and also states individually have the capacity to bring justice to the victims of Islamic State. And also we need to show that we can prosecute the members of the Islamic State who have committed international crimes. It's some sort of the deterrent effect of criminal justice. It could prevent foreign fighters from joining the Islamic State, but also why not convince some of them to stop fighting, or at least to fight in accordance with international law. And then the third point we're going to address today is the question of state responsibility. Here again, it's another avenue to defeat the Islamic State. Why? Because we believe that it's important that we show to the international community that the responsibility of states supporting the Islamic State, in particular supporting from a financial point of view, the responsibility can be engaged in international law. And by financing, we don't necessarily mean directly financing. We don't believe that there are states today who directly finance the Islamic State, as I was telling you the other day, but indirectly financing, providing support, for instance, by letting the Islamic State to smuggle crude oil on the territory, such is the case of Turkey. So we're going to determine whether and how the international responsibility of these states providing support to the Islamic State can be engaged. So our presentation intends today to be short, short for Italian and French standard, which is, we'll try to make it short. And then we will gladly answer all your questions during the Q&A session. So let's start with the question of the use of force. And so, yeah, Antonio, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Jean-Baptiste. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, so thank you, first of all, for welcoming me here today. I have to say it's a great honor to speak at the Duke School of Law. And thank you, Jean-Baptiste, for giving me this possibility. When talking about use of force, we have to first bear in mind, before delving into the facts of the airstrikes in Iraq, Syria, and Libya, that there is a clear prohibition in international law against the use of armed force in international relations. You can read it here. In Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, it says, all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. What's happening, and it has been happening since August 2014, is that a bunch of states have been using armed force on the territory of some sovereign states, Iraq, Syria, all over the world. Most recently, there have been some more consistent attacks in Libya. So we have to wonder whether this use of armed force is somehow justifiable, taking into account that the general rule would be that armed force cannot be used. There are, however, three exceptions to the general prohibition on the use of armed force. Three exceptions that are all relevant in the case of the use of force against Islamic State. The first is consent of the state on which the force is being used. So in our case, in the examples that we gave, consent of Iraq, Syria, or Libya. We'll see the specifics of the facts later on. The second possible avenue is to invoke self-defense, which means saying that the use of force is a response to a prior use of armed force by Islamic State. We'll see in a minute whether this is a possible legal avenue. The third possibility to justify the use of force against Islamic State would be to say that the use of force is authorized by the United Nations Security Council. As you know, the United Nations Security Council is the body of the United Nations mandated with the protection of international peace and security. It is the only body which can authorize states to use force in international relations when international peace and security are threatened. So let's go to the specifics of these three exceptions. And let's start with consent. What does it mean, consent? When can it legalize the use of armed force? Basically, there are two explanations as to why consent makes the use of armed force legal. One explanation is that whenever the owner of a right gives you the possibility to infringe that right, then there is no violation. For example, if the owner of a garden invites you to enter the garden, there is no trespassing because you're not violating the right of the person to privacy and to maintain its property. With the use of force, it's the same. Each state, let's say Iraq, he is the owner of the right not to be attacked. But if Iraq one day realizes that it needs an external intervention can go to Iran, for example, and ask them, well, why don't you come and use force in our territory? In that case, there is no violation of a right because it's the owner of the right asking the use of force, which would be otherwise the violation. There is a second explanation as to why consent legalizes the use of force. You remember that we read in Article 2.4 that use of force is prohibited when is against the political independence or sovereignty of a state. In this case, if it's the territorial state requiring armed intervention, its own sovereignty is not being violated. Actually, it's its own sovereign decision to invite someone else to use force. There are, however, some requirements for consent to be a valid justification for the use of force. The first requirement is that consent is express. So tacit consent is not a valid justification for the use of force. You might remember that at the beginning, when the US coalition started carrying out airstrikes in Syria, there was no clear justification for the use of force, and some people argued, well, but the Assad regime is not protesting, so we might imply that gave its tacit consent to the airstrikes against the Islamic State on Syria's territory. Well, actually, tacit consent doesn't change anything from a legal perspective, because the established legal framework foresees that consent must be expressed in order to justify the use of armed force. Secondly, consent must come from an authority which is able to engage the state, which is able to represent the state in international relations. This means that consent must be valid. Now, consent coming from the head of state, like Assad in Syria's case, inviting Russia, or from the Iraqi prime minister inviting the US and Iran, that's a valid consent, at least at first sight. One might wonder whether Assad is able to actually represent Syria, but from an international perspective, he is still the head of state, even though he lost control over big parts of the territory. The same goes for Iraq. Therefore, consent, even though might come from a government that lost effective control over the entire territory, still is, from an international point of view, valid. Let's move to the second possible justification for the use of force. The second possible justification for the use of force is the one that has been argued the most consistently since the beginning of the airstrikes in Iraq and Syria. And it's the justification of self-defense. Self-defense is provided for in Article 51 of the UN Charter. It reads, "Nothing in the present Charter shall impair the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member of the United Nations until the Security Council has taken measures necessary to maintain international peace and security. Measures taken by members in the exercise of this right of self-defense shall be immediately reported to the Security Council and shall not in any way affect the authority and responsibility of the Security Council under the present Charter to take at any time such action as it deems necessary in order to maintain or restore international peace and security." So we may immediately notice a couple of things from Article 51 dealing with self-defense. I would say three main things can be noted. First of all, self-defense can be either individual or collective. It means that states can use force in self-defense either to protect their own interests or to protect another state who has asked for their help. To go back to our facts, what happened in Iraq, it was that Iraq invited the United States with the relevant coalition and Iran with its own coalition on its territory. But then these same states claimed that they are acting on Syria's territory in the exercise of the right of collective self-defense of Iraq. So what's happening, to make it clear, in Syria, where there is no consent of the territorial government to the airstrikes by the US-led coalition, the United States and their allies are claiming that they are acting in collective self-defense of Iraq. Now, second thing that must be noticed is that self-defense is only triggered when there has been a prior armed attack. So you see here in the test I highlighted it. What's an armed attack? It's not an expression that's easy to decipher, actually. There is no proper definition of armed attack in the UN Charter, and there has never been a comprehensive definition. One can attempt to infer a definition of armed attack from several UN instruments. In particular, the most accepted definition of armed attack comes from an interpretation of the UN General Assembly resolution defining acts of aggression. And the definition that comes forward from this analysis is that an armed attack, sorry for my English, I apologize. An armed attack is an intentional intervention in or against another state without that state's consent or subsequent acquiescence, an intervention which is not legally justified. Now, with regards to armed attacks, there are two main problems in current international law, two huge problems that are very relevant for the use of force against the Islamic State. The first of these problems is the timing of the armed attack when compared to the timing of the response in self-defense. And the second of these problems is the author of the armed attack. When can we use force in self-defense? Is it only when a state attacks or only when a non-state actor attacks? Let's see these two problems in sequence. Let's start with the timing. The UN Charter, in Article 51, talks about ongoing armed attacks. So self-defense can be used when there is a military intervention which is currently ongoing. So let's imagine in Iraq, Islamic State is performing continuously armed attacks. They are fighting to expand the territory they control, the same in Syria. The attack by Islamic State is ongoing. Therefore, it triggers the possibility of acting in self-defense. But what about countries where Islamic State is not operating yet? What about preventing armed attacks? Because some countries have expressed the willingness to use force in self-defense even when the attack is not ongoing yet, but it is imminent. Sorry. Oh, where it is? Yeah, exactly. The argument is that if we wait until the armed attack starts, then we are necessarily suffering some damages. And some armed attacks, they cannot be fought in the immediacy. The response requires some time. Let's think about an armed attack like the one that happened in Paris, that I think reasonably can be considered as an armed attack on 13 November 2015. The response to that attack by France did not cancel the fact that more than 100 people lost their lives. France replied, started bombarding Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. But it was too late to save the lives of those who were killed in Paris. So states who put forward the theory of imminence say that one a state must be able to use force even before the armed attack starts, as long as it can be proven that the attacker has the intention and capability to carry out the attack. Now, this justification is used quite often. You know, the United States have a policy of conducting airstrikes, either by drones or by manned vehicles, against alleged terrorists, with the justification that in so doing, they are preventing possible attacks against the United States, even on US territory. However, despite there is an emerging acceptance for this idea, this is not a rule that is crystallized in international law clearly yet. What is sure is that you can use force in response to an ongoing or to a past armed attack. But you cannot use force necessarily, or at least some people contest that you can use force before an attack has actually taken place. This has a huge impact on the operations that are currently being conducted in Libya, where the control by Islamic State is less extensive than in Iraq and Syria, and where the airstrikes campaign is still not as extensive and coordinated as in Iraq and Syria, because it seems, even though there have been no official statements by the states involved in Libya, it seems that the justification for the airstrikes there is precisely that of a preventive self-defense against attacks that they are being planned. They haven't occurred yet. This justification is used quite often, you'll see, and it has been used in general extensively during the war on terror for attacks, for airstrikes in Yemen, in Pakistan, and so on and so forth. So it's important to bear it in mind, even with regard to the conflict with Islamic State. But let's move to the second element. I said the second controversial element of the definition of armed attacks. When can we use self-defense? Article 51 of the UN Charter was conceived for interstate warfare. The Second World War was a war fought between states. So the idea when writing the UN Charter was that you could use force in self-defense when another state attacked you. However, warfare has changed. International relations have changed. And now, non-state actors more and more use force. So the question is, can a state, let's say the United States, use force in self-defense in a second state, let's say Syria, not against the Syrian state, but against a non-state actor, the Islamic State, which is conducting armed attacks or planning or whatever, armed attacks against the first self-defending state? That's the question. And the problem is that there is no clear-cut answer. Of course, states carrying out airstrikes in Syria, not only the United States, also the United Kingdom, France, Turkey, Canada until a certain point, Australia, they all believed that it was possible to use force in self-defense against non-state actors. And this goes in the direction of creating a strong state practice for the use of force in self-defense against non-state actors. So maybe what was not the rule in 1948, it's becoming the rule now. And I say it's becoming because it's not so clear-cut yet. We are talking about, 8 to 10 states using force out of 190 state members of the United Nations. Of course, this practice is indicative of a tendency, of a trend to use force against non-state actors. And the states who are using force, they will tell you, well, it's an established rule, there is no doubt. But some other states are still not so sure. Even admitting that force can be used in self-defense against non-state actors, there are some doubts as to whether this is a general rule or as to whether the original armed attack from a non-state actor needs to be of a certain character and scale. The other doubt is whether we can always use force against a non-state actor or only when certain conditions are met. What happens is that several of the states involved in the airstrikes in Syria, they're not saying, okay, it's fine to use force against non-state actors. They add a little nuance. And actually, these states include the United States government. They say, we are only using force against ISIS in Syria because the Syrian government is not able or willing to prevent ISIS to attack us from there. It's an explanation of necessity. Basically, what the United States and their allies are saying is that, well, we wouldn't use force against non-state actors on Syria's territory because this creates problems for Syria's sovereignty. But we are forced to do so by necessity because the Syrian government does not protect us, does not fight Islamic State enough in order to prevent danger for us. So since the Syrian government is not able, is unable, and is unwilling to prevent ISIS from using their territories, then we must step in and use force in self-defense against Islamic State on Syria's territory. I told you some scholars, but not some states, have argued that the use of force in self-defense against non-state actors is only possible when the original armed attack is of a sufficient scale. But this, it's quite murky idea, and it's quite difficult to define what's small scale, what's large scale, is it Paris big enough or not. So this is really a proposition by the doctrine that has never been translated into any official statements by states involved in airstrikes against Islamic State. One thing that we must bear in mind is that even if admitted, the use of force against non-state actors, force can only be used against the non-state actor carrying the armed attack. It means that force cannot be used against other non-state actors on the same territory, which are maybe part of related conflicts. Why do I say this? You know that Russia has been invited by Assad to use force in Syria. What is Russia doing is that despite the invitation is to fight Islamic State, there are allegations that Russia is also targeting the Free Syrian Army. Also, now, this has never happened for the US-led coalition. There have been no allegations that the US-led coalition has targeted in the use of self-defense any other group other than the Islamic State and associated groups. But we must be clear that it's not just because they don't want to attack other people. It's also because the law does not consent them to attack other people. The US or Iran, to have a look at the other coalition operating in the same conflict, they cannot attack the Free Syrian Army because the Free Syrian Army, even if it operates on the same territory, has not posed any armed attack against the US or Iran or Iraq. They can only attack Islamic State, so the armed group posing the original threat and carrying out the original armed attacks that have triggered the exercise of the use of force in self-defense. Now, before giving the word to Jean-Baptiste, let's make a small summary then of what justifications are being put forward by states who intervened in Iraq and Syria. I mentioned all of them already, but just to be clear. So, for the sake of clarity, let's divide the conflict with Islamic State in two different sub-conflicts. The conflict that is being fought on Iraqi territory and the conflict that is being fought on Syrian territory. On Iraqi territory, there are two international coalitions fighting Islamic State, one led by the United States and the other one led by Iran. Both of these international coalitions claim that they are using force because of the consent or invitation of the Iraqi government. Now, the situation is much more complicated in Syria. In Syria, there are 2/3 groups of states operating. Russia on its own, the US-led coalition, and to a certain extent the Iran-led coalition. Now, for Russia, we have said that the justification is the consent or invitation of Assad. So that's quite clear. For the other two coalitions, the situation, it's not so clear either. It's not so clear, unfortunately. Now, the traditional explanation at the beginning in August 2014, the explanation was collective self-defense of Iraq. We, Western states, are intervening in Syria in order to protect Iraq from Islamic State. Then, more and more, the claim of collective self-defense changed to a claim of individual self-defense. And the United States, France especially, they started saying, well, we are not only protecting Iraq, we are protecting ourselves against the armed attacks of Islamic State. Now, after November, the situation might have changed. And I'll turn here the word to my friend Jean-Baptiste.
Thank you, Antonio. Indeed, things seem to have changed since November 20th, 2015. What happened that day was exactly 1 week after the Paris attacks, which occurred on 13th November 2015. On November 20th, 2015, the Security Council passed a resolution under Chapter 7, adopted under Chapter 7. It said two very important things that changed the whole thing from a legal point of view. The first one is that they say that the Islamic State constitutes a global and unprecedented threat to international peace and security. What does that mean? It means that this language, the one I underline, a threat to international peace and security, it means that it opens Chapter 7 and gives the possibility for coercive measures under Chapter 7 on the basis of the collective security system. And then the second thing, very important, it's paragraph 5 of the Security Council resolution, when it calls upon members to the Security Council, calls upon member states that have the capacity to do so, to take all necessary measures in compliance with international law. Here, it's extremely important paragraph. Why? Because it means that if you look at what I underlined, to take all necessary measures, it means that it's a very important terminology. It's the diplomatic expression used by the Security Council since 1990, pretty much, to authorize states to use force, not on the basis of self-defense, but on the basis of the collective security system, on the basis of Chapter 7. So since November 20th, so 3 months ago, we could think that states can lawfully use force, use military force against the Islamic State in Syria, not as an act of self-defense, but on the basis of Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. So you see here there is a change of the legal framework. The legal framework changes, so does the legality of the US-led coalition airstrikes against the Islamic State in Syria. So thanks to this resolution 2249, it seems that the US-led coalition airstrikes against IS in Syria becomes lawful. It's not a matter of self-defense anymore, it's a matter of collective self-defense. And here we can discuss a lot about whether, mean, maybe we can do that afterwards in the discussion, because it seems that the state practice states still rely upon the self-defense argument using this resolution 2249. So before, as Antonio was telling you, you had a clear distinction in international law related to the use of force between, on one side, self-defense, and on the other side, collective security system. It seems, since this resolution, that now the line is much more blurred. Now, let's deal with the second avenues, the individual criminal responsibility. What are the legal avenues available for to hold the Islamic State individuals accountable? And here you have to distinguish two levels: the national level and the international level. At the national level, so what jurisdictional links could states use to exercise the jurisdiction over the Islamic State members? It's quite simple. If you look at Syria and Iraq, they can exercise the criminal jurisdiction over IS members on the basis of the territoriality principle. Now, what about foreign states? Foreign states can rely upon four titles of jurisdiction, four heads of jurisdiction. The first one is the active personality principle. Let's recall here that most of the IS members, they're not Syrian nationals or Iraqi nationals, they're foreign fighters. And therefore, they could be prosecuted by their home countries. And it's actually what, for instance, the UK did, or France is doing. They opened an investigation against some of their nationals currently, allegedly, committing international crimes in Syria and Iraq. You can also use the passive personality principle. And here it's quite easy. You have numerous crimes committed in Syria and Iraq by IS against foreign nationals, like journalists or humanitarian workers. So that could be another title. The third one could be the universality principle, as long as the national legislation provides so, and as long as the individual is within the territory. It's what we call the conditional universal jurisdiction, which is widely admitted. And the fourth one could be the protective principle. It's quite an interesting principle, even though it's often forgotten. It is true that, to the best of my knowledge, in the past, the protective principle was only used for subversive activities, like counterfeiting, for instance, or spying. But however, in my eyes, you could use it here in the Syrian context. Because in my eyes, the spillover effect of armed conflict, of the Syrian conflict, on the neighboring territories can amount to a threat to national security of these neighboring states. So to me, this will allow these neighboring states to exercise their jurisdiction on the basis of the protective principle, because of this spillover effects, which often leads to which often leads to a threat to national security. So this is the case in Syria. So we could rely upon the protective principle. I don't think this principle should be forgotten. And then at the international level, you could use, of course, you could create an international criminal tribunal, like, for instance, we did for ex-Yugoslavia, or we did for Rwanda. The problem here is that, at least today, it's very unlikely, because mostly because of financial constraints, because let's not forget that we're just coming out of an economic crisis, and that states, I don't think they're ready to pay for a very expensive international criminal tribunal. And also, and I think more importantly, I don't think states could agree today, at least the member states of the Security Council, the states member of the Security Council, they could agree on the material and personal scope of this international tribunal. I mean, France and the US, for instance, will never accept to have an international criminal tribunal prosecuting and trying only IS members. They would like also the soldiers of the Iraqi army to be tried, but that Russia will never accept, at least for the moment. So let's turn to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, the so-called ICC. It's true that Syria and Iraq are not party to the ICC statute, the so-called Rome statute. However, it doesn't mean that the ICC has no jurisdiction over crimes committed by the Islamic State on those territories. There are three options for the International Criminal Court to exercise its jurisdiction over IS members. The first one will be a Security Council referral. Security Council referral, where you have the Security Council referring the situation in Iraq and Syria to the ICC. Many problems, of course. I think that there are two main problems regarding the definition of the situation. How do you define the situation? From a geographical point of view, can you distinguish Iraq and Syria? Can the Security Council refer the situation in only one of these two countries? If it can, if yes, then perhaps the Security Council could agree on referring the situation in Iraq only. Maybe here the US and Russia, to make it more simple, could agree. Okay, we're referring the situation in Iraq. But if you consider that you cannot if you cannot limitate the situation from a geographical point of view, then Russia will never accept to refer the situation in Syria today. Another problem will be the personal scope. Can the Security Council refer to the ICC only the crimes committed by the Islamic State and not those committed by the Syrian army, for instance? If yes, then the members of the Security Council here again could then refer, maybe they could agree on referring the situation to the ICC. But if they can't, and that's my opinion, that a situation can only be defined geographically, the Security Council cannot refer to the ICC the crimes committed by just one party to the conflict. And here again, in such a case, Russia will veto the referral to protect Assad troops, clearly. Second option, it will be a referral by a state party or investigation initiated by the prosecutor himself, so what we call proprio motu. And here the ICC will have jurisdiction over all crimes committed in Syria and Iraq by nationals of state parties. Here, the problem is, because there are always problems, the problem here doesn't concern the existence of jurisdiction. It's related to the exercise of jurisdiction by the court, because the alleged perpetrator, the victim, witnesses, evidence, they're all in Syria and Iraq. And investigating crimes today in Syria and Iraq in a serious manner, it's almost impossible. I mean, from a logistical point of view, it would be a nightmare for states to do so. And also because, and here it's more legally speaking, according to Article 86 and 89 of the Rome Statute, Syria and Iraq have no obligation to cooperate with the court since they are not state parties. Third option, ad hoc declaration. It's this ad hoc declaration under Article 12.3 of the Rome Statute. It contains the possibility for a non-state party to declare ad hoc its acceptance of the jurisdiction of the court with respect to a certain crime, without ratifying or acceding to the Rome Statute. It's exactly, for instance, what Ukraine did in 2014 for crimes committed between November 2013 and February 2014. I mean, let's be honest, Syria will never do it, clearly. Now, Iraq, and actually it's interesting, Iraq is actually nowadays considering lodging an ad hoc declaration under Article 12.3. But there are two things here. First of all, it says it's not ready yet. But I think the real reason is that they're really scared. And I don't think they will ever do it. Why? Because if they accept the jurisdiction of the court under Article 12.3, they accept the jurisdiction over the world situation. Over the world situation, so for all crimes committed not only by the Islamic State, but by also the Iraqi government. And there are allegations today that the Iraqi government has also committed international crimes in Iraq. So, honestly, I don't think that will ever happen. They're very scared, and actually that's understandable. But if they do, then you will change many things, because then the ICC will retroactively have jurisdiction over all international crimes committed in Iraq from the date the Iraqi government will choose. So jurisdiction over all crimes committed there, regardless of the nationality of the perpetrator. So now, last point, maybe you can just deal with the state responsibility very quickly, and then we can take questions.
Open the floor for questions. Well, just one last reminder about a point that it's very often forgotten, that Islamic State does not exist in a vacuum, and if ISIS reached the level of control that it has now over Iraq and Syria, it's also because we were not particularly attentive in the rest of the world to what the Islamic State was doing. Even if we take out the provision of direct assistance to Islamic State, the problem is that we have given a lot of assistance to other parties to the conflict that ended up in the hands of Islamic State. And that's not only that's not the only way in which Islamic State has been supported by other countries. Other countries, as Jean-Baptiste has alluded to before, have allowed Islamic State to make business with the oil and the other resources that they have. You know that Islamic State gets half of its budget from the oil wells that it controls in Iraq and Syria, in Iraq mostly. How do they make money out of it? They sell it. They smuggle it out of Islamic State, of the territories controlled by the so-called Islamic State. Someone buys it. And, surprise, surprise, one of the main buyers is the Assad regime. So the very same Assad regime that is fighting a war against Islamic State buys oil from Islamic State. And the oil that gets out of Islamic State passes through Turkey. And Turkish authorities have allegedly closed an eye over the smuggling of oil out of Islamic State. Even the Western countries carrying out airstrikes against Islamic State have avoided at the beginning to target precisely the resources that ISIS had, because they were afraid of wasting an incredible amount of oil and money. In so doing, they let Islamic State enrich for a while. Only later on during the campaign, the Western states started targeting the oil trucks and the refinery facilities. But still nowadays, they're not targeting the wells, because it would be an incredible waste, and it's very valuable resources. There are some international rules that would apply in this case. And it's important to remind all states involved in the fight against Islamic State that if we respected all the rules existing in the current international legal framework, maybe Islamic State would not have reached the power that it has now. And the fight against it would have been easier. What are the rules that I'm referring to? In general, there is a prohibition of lending direct or indirect assistance to the commission of internationally wrongful acts, like the ones that have been performed by the Islamic State. But this obligation, it's quite general, and there are doubts as to whether it applies to violations committed by non-state actors like ISIS. But there are some special rules that are very important here, and that apply to violations committed by ISIS. There is an obligation not to be complicit in genocide. And if we buy Islamic State oil, if we let oil getting out of Islamic State, if we don't make checks to the borders in order to allow foreign fighters to join Islamic State, if we sell a lot of weapons to the rebel groups operating in Syria, knowing that these weapons will end up in the hands of Islamic State, we are being complicit in genocide, maybe. We are violating the rules that prohibit arms transfers when they will end up facilitating international crimes. We are indirectly assisting terrorist groups. And what else? There is a very nice rule in Article 1 to the Geneva Conventions that states that states have an obligation to respect and ensure respect for the law of armed conflict, aka international humanitarian law. By sending weapons indiscriminately, by not making checks at the borders, by allowing oil to get smuggled out of Islamic State, indirectly, we are not ensuring respect for the law of armed conflict. We are indirectly not protecting the population under Islamic State's rule. And this is true especially for Iraq and Syria, who at the beginning did not put up a coordinated response against ISIS. And we might fail our obligation to prevent acts of genocide. So it is not only important to fight ISIS with airplanes. It is not only important to bring ISIS perpetrators to criminal justice, but it's also important to respect the existing international legal obligations, which would have weakened Islamic State since the beginning. Luckily, now there has been an awakening, and these obligations are being taken into account more and more. But what led to the current situation is that at the beginning we overlooked them. So, with that being said, and hoping that we might be successful in this fight, I leave you the floor for questions, and I thank you very much for your attention so far.
So does anyone have questions? Yes.
I have a question regarding the last point regarding genocide. I know that John Kerry a couple of days ago did in fact say that there are acts of genocide occurring under Daesh rule. How do you see that changing the calculation of, especially the U.S. bloc, and do you foresee any effects on the general conversation between the U.S. and Russia in regards to what's happening as well?
Yeah, I would like to answer. So, militarily, it doesn't change much, I think. The decision of the type of military involvement will not depend on the moral justification for the war. The crimes that have been committed so far, before Kerry said that it was genocide, were equally serious. Crimes against humanity, war crimes. The fact of changing the label, it might change things for the public opinion, but it doesn't change the original decision of the state, of the United States, as to what kind of military resources to employ. So if they thought before that the air campaign with airstrikes was the best way to go, they will not change their military calculations now just because they changed the label of the crimes that are being committed by ISIS members. With regard to the relations with Russia, well, in that case, it might change something. In general, not only in relations with Russia, but everything that has to do with the politics of the war against Islamic State. So not the amount of military involvement, but all the side issues. So, for example, the legal argument that is used to justify the use of force, or the possibility of involving the International Criminal Court. Using the word genocide is a powerful tool of rejecting criticisms for what you're doing, because it gives you some sort of legitimacy. So I think that one of the reasons why this word is being used is in order to start fighting criticism exactly from Russia or from China regarding everything that surrounds the war with Islamic State. So yes, the answer is no as to the military part, and yes as to the relations with other countries that might express criticism. I don't know whether you want to.
Is there any other question?
Yeah, actually I have a question. So I've been reading lots of proposals to have the Kurdish people from Turkey to fight with the ISIS and saying they are the most efficient or something. What would be a legal argument that support their involvement with this? If I'm not sure on this, but if they are not specifically attacked by the ISIS yet, or they're not in great danger immediately.
You mean like Kurds fighting against the Islamic State? They do.
Yeah, but are they part of the U.S.-led coalition, or?
No, they're not part, because the U.S.-led coalition is just states.
Right.
But the thing is that, and I think it's what I was saying the other day, and I still believe it, is that I think we need to work more closely with the Kurds. Clearly, we need to provide them more means, because at the end of the day, they are the more efficient actors on the ground fighting the Islamic State, much more than the US-led coalition, to be honest.
Your legal basis for their involvement with this, especially with the use of force?
Well, from an international, I mean, they can. It's like they have the. I mean, I don't even know if it's a matter of international law at the end of the day, because because it's a conflict between two armed groups within the same territory. You have the Kurds from Iraq fighting against Syria, against Syria, but fighting against the Islamic State in Iraq, and then you have the Kurds from Syria fighting against the Islamic State in Syria. So it's clearly, I mean, there are some international law involved in the sense, for instance, international humanitarian law will apply in terms of what rules do they have to follow when they fight. But in terms of jus ad bellum, in terms of use of force, I don't think here there is any problem in that regard. But just to come back on the Kurds, it's not really a legal point, it's more like a political point. I think here, again, we have to work more closely. And here Turkey has a very weird position, you know? Because on one side, of course, Turkey's worst enemy is Assad. Clearly. But in the same time, they also have very strong enemies being the Kurds. And they smuggle oil on their territory. They say that they have closed their border. They don't have, I mean, all the oil, I think recently I read an article saying that 75% of the oil smuggled by the Islamic State is sold on the Turkish territory. And here I think there is clearly something. And as Antonio was saying, I think we can clearly engage the international responsibility of Turkey for doing that. You see? You want to add something, Antonio?
Yeah, I want to add that there has been some support by the US-led coalition for the Kurds fighting in Kobane. You know, there was this time of Kobane at the top of the Syrian border, very close to Iraq, which was besieged by Islamic State, by ISIS, but was defended by Kurds fighters. So even in the absence of an official alliance, the US-led coalition conducted some airstrikes against ISIS around Kobani, which indirectly helped the resistance by the Kurds. So what happened was that the US-led coalition helped the Kurds defend their position, even though there was no official alliance. And again, this is quite weird for Turkey, which is a member of the US-led coalition, but considers the Kurds as terrorists, and therefore has a very, very undefined position on the issue.
Are there any? Yes.
What, like the more recent attacks in Istanbul, both, I mean, from what I understand, the government, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the government has said the most recent attack was ISIS, but the prior attack was PKK. So how does that...
Are you talking about the one in Istanbul and the one in Ankara, which happened last week, I think? Yeah, last week.
Yeah. How does that... I guess it's more of a political question than a legal one, but how do you think that affects Turkey's approach here?
Well, I mean, to be honest, it's an extremely sensitive question, even though it's extremely, of course, it's extremely dramatic, and the Turkish government is never going to be happy about such an attack coming from the PKK. But they claim that it's the PKK, and I think actually the PKK would say that it was them. To be honest, Turkey must be, I mean, the Turkish government, Erdogan, must be quite happy about it because it justifies, because the thing is that Turkey is bombarding PKK position in Turkey. And so for them, it's an additional justification for bombarding the PKK. And so that's why I think it's extremely, I mean, to me, it doesn't change anything. The only thing is that I think if it was actually the PKK, it's a terrible mistake, because the thing is that not only the PKK, because the PKK is just is the Kurds in Turkey, but just the Kurds in general. I mean, let's be honest, they've been raising international support since the beginning of the conflict, clearly, because they are the most efficient actors on the ground. And doing that, it kind of, like cancels the whole effect. And I think that was, but it's not a legal question, it's more like a strategic and a political question here. But I think it's, I mean, for Erdogan, it's like, it's perfect, because it justifies just more bombing and against the PKK in Turkish territory. Sorry?
But then a week later, there's an ISIS attack, so it's not so clear-cut.
Yeah, but I mean, but that also shows the lack of efficiency of the Turkish government, that they are unable to actually fight against the Islamic State, and they're unable to fight against the PKK. And in both main cities of Turkey, they have like bombings coming from two different fronts. You see? So I think it's Turkish. I mean, it just shows that Turkey, even though they're strongly involved, I think the most important question for Turkey is refugees. You know, it's clearly refugees. Is what are we going to do with these refugees? So I'm sure you saw they're trying to negotiate an agreement with the European Union to see what are we going to do with the refugees. To be honest, it's the top of the priorities. This and the PKK. They don't want to have the PKK to have more support. And the rest, they say that they do. They say that they close the border. They say that they have to keep an eye on the border, that they don't smuggle oil, but it's wrong. There are reports, and really credible, credible reports that say the contrary. So to me, it's a very tricky position. But you know, it's also, to me, Turkey is a bit in the same situation as Israel. The only difference is that Turkey is saying that it's doing stuff for the conflict. Israel is not doing anything. The problem why I'm saying that is I'm just saying that, of course, Israel is not going to support the Islamic State. Of course, it's normal. No one wants to support the Islamic State. But in the same time, it doesn't want to support Assad neither. Because supporting Assad, it's supporting Iran and the Hezbollah, which are the worst enemies of Israel.
Well, yeah.
You know what I mean? No, but what I'm saying is that at least they keep the distance with the conflict, and it's true that they are not very much involved.
Yeah, but there's some reports that, yeah.
That's...
The Israelis are more comfortable with Assad than they are with ISIS. But yeah.
They're more comfortable or what?
With Assad than with ISIS.
They may be more comfortable with Assad, but I don't think...
Sure about that?
Yeah.
I don't think, they're more comfortable with Assad, but the thing is that, to be honest, supporting Assad is supporting Iran and the Hezbollah. So I think it's, on the long run, I think Iran is a bigger threat to Israel than the Islamic State. Because Iran is a proper state, and it's, at the end of the day, much more powerful than the Islamic State. But they keep their distance with the conflict. You don't hear many foreign policy papers dealing with the conflict with the Islamic State, you know?
Right, but for a long time, Assad wasn't just Iran. I mean, Assad has become a proxy from Iran more recently. So the military establishment's a bit confused. So anyway, sorry. I think the Israeli military is a little bit hesitant about... They don't want Iran on the border, that's for sure. But for a long time, Assad wasn't Iran. So as long as Assad had his own agenda to set, they were more comfortable with his regime rather than...
Yeah, well, until a certain extent. But I mean, Assad has been a long time ally of Iran, such as Hezbollah. So it's the Shia versus... Absolutely, and until this whole thing happened, I mean, until the conflict started, it was relatively fine. They were dealing with the regime and they were fine. But then when it started blowing up, I think now the position is actually the correct one. They keep the distance with that. I mean, I don't know if it's the correct one, but you see, I mean, it's understandable. It's what I want to say. You want to add something, Antonio?
No.
Thank you. Is there another? We can take one last question and then finish. Yes, please.
Keep going for Iran, please. We are Iranian, and we know how terrible the present regime is, and how maneuvers from one to another. So could you explain a little bit what position do they have in this?
The Iranian government?
Yeah.
The Iranian government is probably the strongest support to the Assad regime, together with the Hezbollah. And so, it's the strongest support, and they also send militias officially upon the invitation of the Iraqi government to the Iraqi territory. I mean, as far as I know, maybe I'm wrong, but I didn't see any report in that sense saying that we have Iranian militias in Syrian territory, but there are reports of Iranian militias on Iraqi territory upon the invitation of the Iraqi government. And, it's the whole, the Iranian government, the Iraqi government, and Assad and the Hezbollah, and actually even geographically speaking, it's like a line. They're the strongest allies against the rest of the Arab world. And this conflict, this opposition between Iran and the other states, it's taking place on Syrian and Iraqi territory, but we also have it in other states like Yemen. Yemen, at the end of the day, it's a very similar situation where you have, at the end of the day, some sort of war between the Sunni world and the Shia world. And you have different territories on which this armed conflict is taking place.
And Russia, too.
Sorry?
Russia.
Russia too.
Russia too, absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And just to clarify what's the situation on the ground, the Iran-led coalition to fight against Islamic State has also some troops on the ground, unlike the US-led coalition. The US-led coalition is mostly, for the greatest part, only conducting airstrikes, even though now there are allegations that some troops have been sent in Iraq with the consent of the Iraqi government. But the Irani intervention against ISIS, since the beginning, has been an intervention with troops on the ground and airstrikes. So there has been very strong involvement in the war against Islamic State, for understandable reasons, because Iran is the champion of the Shia world, whilst Islamic State, they are Sunnis mostly, and there is a clash of culture and of religion, and not only a clash for control of resources and territory.
And one last thing, and maybe we have to actually stop here, unfortunately, is when you think about it, it's dramatic, but it's also very interesting from an international relations point of view. Even though, Iran and the US are on the same side. And when you think about it, they say they're not. They're not in the same coalition. And that's true that officially, formally speaking, the US has its own coalition, and the Iranian have their own coalition too. But at the end of the day, they're on the same side. They're fighting the same enemy. And if you think about it, just go back like 5 or 6, 7 years ago, it's unbelievable to think that. And I still think that the Iranian government is a key actor. It's not necessarily a good thing, but they have to be involved in one way or another in the discussions, because they play such an important role, which is not necessarily a good role, but they play a role, and they have to be. To me, a part of the negotiation, clearly. We have to conclude here, I think. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.